There are things that happen in this world that no textbook will ever prepare you for. Things that sit at the edge of what we call real and refuse to move. This is one of those things. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Have you ever witnessed something that you couldn't explain? Something that made you question everything you thought you understood about the world around you? Leave it in the comments. I read every single one. And while you think about that, let me tell you about Harlan County, Kentucky. In the autumn of 1931, the mountains of eastern Kentucky were already a hard place to live. The coal mines had been bleeding men for decades. Families scraped what they could from the earth, and the earth gave back just enough to keep them hungry. The hills were old there, older than the country itself, and the people who lived among them carried that oldness in their bones without even knowing it. There was a particular stillness to the hollers in the evening when the last light drained from the ridge-tops and the woods went dark all at once, like something had simply decided the day was over. It was in that kind of place, and in that kind of time, that a man named Elmer Ashmore first encountered something he would spend the rest of his life trying to forget. Elmer was 38 years old in the autumn of 1931. He was not a large man, but he was solid in the way that men who work with their hands tend to become over time. Compact, deliberate, with forearms that looked as though they'd been carved from the same dense wood as the furniture he built. He was a craftsman by trade, one of the last true cabinet makers in the county, and his hands showed it. The knuckles were permanently darkened with wood stain, the fingertips rough as bark, and there was a long, pale scar along the inside of his left thumb from a chisel accident when he was 24 that had never faded properly. His face was lean and angular, with deep-set gray eyes that always seemed to be looking at something just a little further away than whatever was in front of him. People in town said Elmer Ashmore thought too much. They didn't mean it as a compliment. He had a shop on the edge of a small settlement called Cold Mount Hollow. Not much more than a wide spot in a gravel road, really, with a general store, a church, a post office that was only open 3 days a week, and maybe 30 families scattered across the surrounding hills. Elmer lived alone. He'd been married once, briefly, but that was a decade behind him, and he rarely spoke of it. He kept to himself, worked long hours, and spent his evenings reading whatever books the county library would let him borrow. He was the kind of man that a community like Cold Mount Hollow respected without particularly liking. Steady, reliable, a little too quiet. In the second week of October, 1931, a woman named Cora Winterbourne came to Elmer's shop. Cora was 62 years old, tall and thin in the way of someone who had once been commanding and was now simply angular. Her white hair was pulled back tightly, and her dark eyes moved with a quickness that her body no longer shared. She was, by all accounts, the person you went to in Cold Mount Hollow when the doctor was too far away or too expensive. She knew herbs, knew the old ways of managing pain and fever, and she'd helped bring more people through difficult winters than anyone cared to count. She was not the kind of woman you dismissed. She came to Elmer's shop not for furniture. She came because she didn't know where else to go. She told him about a man who had arrived in the hollow 3 days earlier. No one knew his name. No one had seen him come in. He had simply appeared, as people sometimes do in small mountain communities, without announcement or explanation. He was found one morning sitting on the stone wall outside the general store, and when the storekeeper, a heavy-set man named Floyd Grimshaw, asked him what his business was, the man said only that he was passing through and needed somewhere to rest for a few days. Floyd let him sleep in the back of the store. He seemed harmless enough. He was quiet, well-mannered, ate little, and asked for nothing except water and occasional use of the wood stove to get warm. What made Cora come to Elmer was not the man himself. It was the other thing, the thing that had arrived with him, or perhaps the thing that had arrived because of him. Elmer listened. He was not a man who interrupted. Cora told him that on the first night after the stranger appeared, she had woken at some hour she couldn't name, deep in the night, well past midnight, to a sound she described as someone dragging a piece of iron across a wooden floor. She'd gotten up and checked her house. Nothing. She'd looked outside. Nothing moved in the darkness except the wind in the oaks. But the sound, she said, had not come from outside. It had come from beneath her. Her house had no cellar. That was the first night. On the second night, 3 other families in the hollow had reported variations of the same disturbance. Not the same sound. Each person described something slightly different. The wife of one of the miners said she'd heard breathing in the corner of her bedroom, slow and even, as though someone were asleep standing up. A man named Luther Coldwell, who lived on the upper road, said he'd woken to find the mirror in his hallway turned to face the wall, though he lived alone and had been in bed since dark. An older woman, whose name Elmer didn't catch, had found every window in her kitchen fogged from the inside, despite the room being cold. None of them could explain it. All of them, without being prompted, had the same feeling. The feeling that something had come to Cold Mount Hollow that was paying close attention. Elmer asked Cora what she wanted him to do about it. He was a cabinet maker. He built things from wood. He was not sure what any of this had to do with him. Cora said she wasn't sure either, but she'd been watching the stranger for 3 days, and there was something about him that she needed another pair of eyes on. Something she couldn't quite put into words. And Elmer, she said, was the only person in the hollow she trusted to look at something carefully without making a decision about it before he'd fully seen it. That, he admitted later, was the only reason he agreed to go. And since we're here together in this moment, I have to ask, have you ever been pulled towards something you couldn't explain? Not by fear, not by curiosity exactly, but by something quieter than both of those things? Some pull you couldn't name? Leave it in the comments. Because what Elmer felt walking toward that general store that afternoon was exactly that, and he would not understand it for a very long time. This story is being brought to you by Behind Dark Tales. If you're finding yourself leaning in a little closer, if the room around you feels just slightly different than it did when you started listening, then you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. And if you're hearing this somewhere other than Behind Dark Tales, know that this content was taken without permission. Please report it for us. The stranger was sitting near the wood stove when Elmer arrived. He was younger than Elmer had expected, perhaps 25, perhaps a few years older, though it was genuinely difficult to say. His face had a quality that resisted easy reading, the way certain landscapes do when the light is wrong. He was of average height, with dark hair that needed cutting and hands that were folded in his lap with an almost deliberate stillness. His clothes were worn, but not dirty. The clothes of someone who had been traveling a long time but took care of what he had. His eyes, when he looked up at Elmer, were an unsettling shade of pale green, almost gray, and they held the particular quality of eyes that have looked at a great many things without being changed by them. He said his name was Thomas, just Thomas. Elmer sat across from him, and they talked for a while, or rather, Elmer asked questions, and Thomas answered them with the careful economy of someone who had learned that the less he said, the better things generally went. He'd come from the western part of the state, he said. He was heading north, eventually. He didn't say toward what. Elmer studied him the way he studied a piece of wood before deciding how to cut it, looking for the grain, looking for the hidden stresses, the places where it might split unexpectedly, and what he found, or thought he found, was not malevolence, not danger in any obvious sense. What he found was a profound and exhausting sadness, and something else, something that Elmer couldn't name that day, though he would spend years afterward trying. The best he ever managed to describe it, and he told this story only twice in his life, both times to people he trusted absolutely, was this. Sitting across from Thomas in that dim, wood-stove-warm general store in the autumn of 1931, Elmer had the unshakable feeling that the young man was not entirely alone. Not in the way that people are not alone when there are others in the room. In a different way, in the way that a room is not empty, even when there is no one visible in it. He spent 2 hours with Thomas that first day. When he left, he stood in the cool October air outside the store for a long time before he could make himself walk back to his shop. That night, Elmer woke at an hour he couldn't determine. His bedroom was dark and cold. The fire in the downstairs stove had gone out, which was unusual. He'd banked it well before bed, and it typically held through the night. He lay still for a moment, listening, the way you do when you wake without knowing why. There was a sound, not the iron-dragging sound Cora had described, not breathing, not footsteps, a voice, or something close to a voice, close enough that his mind tried to make words out of it, tried to find the shape of language in it, and almost succeeded, almost, before it faded. It was gone by the time he'd sat up in bed. He checked the house, cold and empty. He looked out every window. The hollow was dark and absolutely still. No moon, a thin scattering of stars between the clouds. He went back to bed. He did not sleep. At first light, he went back to the general store. Thomas was still there, awake and seated by the cold stove, though somehow, despite the cold, looking as though he'd slept adequately. Elmer asked him directly, without preamble, if he was aware of the disturbances happening in the hollow since his arrival. Thomas looked at him for a long moment. Then he said yes. He said he was very sorry about it. He said this was why he kept moving. Elmer pulled a chair close and lowered his voice and said he needed Thomas to explain. And Thomas, for the first time since arriving in Coldmount Hollow, seemed to genuinely struggle with something, seemed to weigh his words not out of habit or caution, but out of what looked very much like grief. He said he couldn't explain it fully. He'd tried with other people in other places, and the explanations never covered what was actually happening. He said that he'd been this way for as long as he could remember, since before he was old enough to understand what it meant. and that every person who had ever tried to document it, to study it, to find the mechanism behind it, had eventually given up or walked away or simply decided he was something to be avoided rather than understood. He said, "I don't do it. I don't make it happen. I don't control it. It just follows." Elmer said, "What follows?" Thomas looked at the floor for a moment. Then he said, "I think it's attention." He said that was the best word he'd ever found for it. Not spirits, not energy, not any of the words that people wanted to use when they didn't have the right one, just attention. As though something vast, something that existed in a way he couldn't describe, had at some point turned its focus toward him. And wherever he went, that focus went with him. And whatever was near him got caught in it, the way objects get caught in the light when you turn a lamp in their direction. He wasn't the source, he said. He was the reason. Elmer sat with that for a long time. Then he asked the question that had been sitting at the back of his mind since the night before, since waking in the cold and hearing that almost voice in the dark. He asked, "Is it dangerous?" Thomas looked up at him, and for the first time something moved behind those pale gray-green eyes. Something complicated, something that suggested the question was one he had asked himself more times than he could count, and that he still did not have an answer he was fully comfortable with. He said, "I've never seen it hurt anyone." He paused. He said, "But I've seen it change people." He said, "There's a difference." Elmer thought about that for a long time afterward. He thought about the mirror turned to face the wall in Luther Coldwell's hallway. He thought about the fogged windows in the cold kitchen. He thought about the sound beneath Cora Winterbourne's house, in the cellar that didn't exist. He thought about the voice in his own bedroom at the unnamed hour, shaping itself almost into words. He asked Thomas what the people who had been changed were changed into. Thomas was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "More themselves." He said, whatever they were most, they became more of it. Whatever they were holding back, it came forward. Whatever they were afraid of inside themselves, they stopped being afraid of it, or they became very afraid of it, depending on what it was. He said, "It doesn't seem to judge." He said, "It just looks." And something about those words, the simplicity of them, the weight behind them, hit Elmer in a way he had not expected. Not with fear, not exactly, with something that felt uncomfortably close to recognition. Because he had spent 38 years in these mountains being a man who looked at things carefully before making decisions about them. And here, sitting across from him in a cold general store in the hollow, was something that did the same, only from a direction he didn't have a name for. He didn't tell Cora all of this. He told her enough. That Thomas seemed harmless, that the disturbances would likely stop when the young man moved on, that she should let Floyd know there was no reason to turn him out. He kept the rest of it in his chest, the way men of his generation and temperament tended to keep things. Thomas stayed 3 more days. On the 4th morning, he was gone. He left before the hollow woke up. No note, no goodbye, just an absence where his presence had been, like a word someone has spoken that you're still hearing the echo of, even though the room is quiet now. The disturbances stopped. Not gradually, not slowly, fading out the way a sound fades with distance, all at once. The mirror in Luther Coldwell's hallway was found turned back to face the room. The kitchen windows of the older woman, whose name Elmer had never caught, were clear and dry. Cora Winterbourne slept through the night, for the first time in a week. And Elmer went back to his shop, and he went back to his work, and he built furniture with the same careful hands he'd always had. And he lived in Cold Mount Hollow for another 22 years before he left. But some things were different. Small things, mostly. Things he would have had trouble pointing to if anyone asked. He started leaving his windows uncovered at night, something he'd always done before, then stopped doing after his brief marriage, then started again now, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate. He found himself less unsettled by silence than he used to be. He found himself less afraid in general of the particular kind of dark that a hollow gets when the clouds come down low and there's no moon. He read his books differently, more slowly, pausing longer, as though something in the text was still moving after he'd finished the sentence. And sometimes, not often, not regularly, he would wake in the deep middle of the night and lie still in the dark and feel, not with any particular anxiety or alarm, but simply as a fact, as a condition of the room, as you feel the temperature or the quality of the air, that something was paying attention, not to the hollow, not to the house, to him. He never decided what to make of it. He told the story once to a young doctor passing through the county in 1944, who listened with great interest and many careful questions, and then said he wished he could have studied Thomas directly, and that it was a shame nothing had been documented at the time. Elmer said, "There are things that documentation would change." The doctor looked at him. Elmer said, "The way that watching something changes it. Whatever it is, I think it knows the difference between being looked at and being measured, and I think that difference matters to it." The doctor wrote some notes anyway. Elmer never found out what became of them. He told the story a second time, late in life, to Cora Winterbourne's granddaughter, a serious young woman in her 30s who'd come back to the county to settle her grandmother's estate, and found Elmer still in his shop, still building things from wood, with the same gray eyes and the same careful hands, now mapped with age in ways they hadn't been in 1931. She asked him if he ever figured out what Thomas had been. Elmer thought about it for a while. Then he said he wasn't sure Thomas had been anything in the sense she meant. He said Thomas had been a man. That much he was certain of. A young man who was very tired and very alone, and who had learned to live with something that most people would have found unbearable. She asked, "And the thing that followed him?" Elmer set down the piece of wood he was holding. He said, "I think it was real. I think it was present. I think it had been around a great deal longer than any of us, and it would go on being around a great deal longer still." She asked, "Was it dangerous?" He said, "Thomas told me he'd never seen it hurt anyone." She said, "And you believed him?" He said, "I believed he believed it." He picked his wood back up. He said, almost to himself, "But I also think he'd learned to look at it a certain way, a way that made it bearable. And I wondered sometimes if looking at it a different way might bring you to a different answer." She wrote her grandmother's name on a box and carried it out to her car. She drove back up out of the hollow as the late afternoon light went gold and thin across the ridge. Elmer went back to his work. He worked until the light failed. Then he stopped. Not because he was finished, not because he was tired, but because the silence in the shop had shifted just slightly, the way it sometimes did in the evenings, in the long years after Thomas had passed through, and he had learned by then to stop when that happened, to sit with it, to let whatever it was know, in the only language he had for it, which was patience and stillness and an absence of fear, that he had noticed, that he was paying attention to. Whether anything was listening, he never found out. He was still not entirely sure the distinction mattered. He left Cold Mount Hollow in 1953 and settled in a small town further east, where he lived quietly and built things from wood until the end. He never reported any more disturbances, but he never closed his curtains at night either, and he always slept with one window left slightly open, just a little, just enough, for reasons he kept entirely to himself. And you? Do you believe there are things in this world that science hasn't found a way to measure yet? Things that exist at the edge of what we're able to see, watching us the way we watch the dark? Leave it in the comments. I want to know what you think. If you have a story, something that happened to you, something that someone you trusted told you, something that never found an explanation, share it with us. It might become our next video. Stay with us for the next one. Until then.